right, so in our last lesson, we talked a little bit about how federalism had evolved over time. So before the Great Depression, it was more a model of dual federalism, where both the federal government and the state government worked in its own spheres with its own powers. Then after the Great Depression, when the federal government had to step in and help the states in terms of getting people back to work and making sure that citizens were able to have some sort of livelihood, the federal government's power expanded, and it's going to move towards this model of cooperative federalism where the state and federal governments are overlapping and sharing power, and they are sharing concerns involving the same issues and policy areas and acting within those same spheres. So now we're going to talk about modern American federalism, so how we can see federalism in action now. So the first thing we're going to talk about is grants in aid. And this is defined as money provided by the federal government to carry out a policy that the national government has decided is important. So this is the federal government providing state governments with funding. And this is going to be the primary tool for achieving policy objectives within the states. So the federal government is providing state governments with funding because they want their policies carried out. This is called fiscal federalism, and it's defined as the government's use of funding to influence policies in the states. And the federal government is going to do this through a few different types of grants, and we're going to talk about each of them. The first is categorical grants, and these provide funding to states or to local or regional governments for specific policy objectives with certain conditions attached to receiving or spending the funds. So the federal government provides states or these local governments with funding. However, that funding must be in compliance with highly specific instructions. So categorical grants might involve requirements for local or state governments to match the funds. So the federal government saying, hey, we'll give you this much funding, but you have to match it. Or it might include specific instructions for how the grants should be used. So what are some examples of categorical grants? First would be a Head Start program. So the federal government providing states with funding that is specifically for a Head Start program. Another example of a categorical grant would be the drinking age. So the legal drinking age is 21. Okay, and that is because in order for states to receive federal highway funds, they had to agree that the drinking age would be 21. So that's an example of a categorical grant, and how these types of grants might include specific instructions for how the grants should be used, or states have to be in compliance in order to receive the funds. These are a national source of power because when states accept the funds, they're also accepting those federal regulations. And I think this cartoon is great because it shows the federal government providing states with benefits, but that also comes with that federal authority, and states might not always want that. Okay, so keep that in mind, that categorical grants are going to be a source of federal power because when states accept those funds, they're also accepting the regulations that come with them. The next type of grant is a block grant. So when President Richard Nixon was elected, he is going to promise to roll back that expansion of federal power. So the Great Depression happens in the 1930s. Move ahead 30, 40 years, and Nixon is going to try to roll back that expansion of national power. And he does this through block grants. So this is the next type of grant. And this is a type of grant in aid that gives state officials more authority in disbursement of federal funds. So it's given for broad purposes with few strings attached. So an example here is that the Department of Health and Human Services provides block grants to set up programs to treat those with drug and alcohol addiction. So block grants could be provided for substance abuse, for community development, for social services, for conservation. So very broad purposes, no strings attached, or very few strings attached. Moving on to revenue sharing and devolution. So revenue sharing actually started in 1972. And it occurs when the federal government apportions tax money to the states with no strings attached. So again, this is the idea of rolling back the federal government's power. So it was a practice where the federal government is going to collect taxes and then distribute a portion to the state and local governments without those specific policy requirements. However, revenue sharing ended in 1986, so we don't have it now, and federal deficits will likely prevent it from happening again in the future. And then the last thing on here is devolution, and this returns authority for federal programs to the states. So moving that authority for different types of federal programs from the national government to the state government. So there's an increase in state autonomy in economic and social policy, and then there's decentralized control and administration of programs. So the federal government's no longer in charge of these programs, the state government is. A good example of devolution is the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. Say that 3 times fast. So this happened under President Clinton. And what this act did is it gave states greater latitude in implementing social welfare programs. Okay, so a social welfare program would have previously had more control by the federal government. Under this act, it gives more control over those types of programs to the state government. So again, a good example of devolution. So what are unfunded mandates? Well, different from these grants where the federal government is providing money, sometimes states are required to pay for government-funded programs without federal funds. So a good example of an unfunded mandate is the American Disabilities Act of 1990, which required states to make existing public buildings accessible without funding. So that means that buildings had to have wheelchair ramps or be handicap accessible in other ways because of this act, or they would not be in compliance with the act. But the federal government did not provide any kind of funding for updating public buildings to meet those requirements. So that is an unfunded mandate. And last, but definitely not least, is federalism in education. So this affects you today. You can see federalism in education today. So in 1965, President Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it's going to be passed in an effort to provide equal educational opportunities. So making sure that schools who receive lesser funding are receiving adequate resources. It was more of a hands-off approach from the federal government. They were providing this funding just to make sure that schools had the adequate resources. Now, the ESEA was reauthorized in 2002 with the No Child Left Behind Act. And this really affected Ms. Collis's age group. Okay? And it provided states with grant money if the states agreed to give standardized testing. So all of those standardized tests that you see today, this is where it starts. So let's talk a little bit about the No Child Left Behind Act and what it involves. So it's going to hold states more accountable for education. It called for highly qualified teachers. Students had to show yearly progress on those standardized tests. If not, there was a threat of sanctions on schools and state governments. And it has been referred to as the single largest expansion of federal power over the nation's education system in history. So the federal government provided states with funding for education, but they had to agree to give those standardized tests every year. Now in 2015, the No Child Left Behind Act was replaced by President Obama. So in 2002, it would have been President Bush. It was replaced by President Obama with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which gives states more latitude in setting education standards, but still requires testing. So under the Every Student Succeeds Act, states can determine their own standards, but the Department of Education must approve the state's education plan. So this is where you are still seeing all of this standardized testing in education. It is part of the federal government providing state governments with funding for education. So federalism in action. And that is the end of this lesson.